Welcome to the Right News Network.
Welcome to your World News Update. I'm Emma, bringing you today's top stories from around the globe. President Trump is ordering a major withdrawal of American military forces from Europe, pulling 5,000 troops out of Germany immediately. But that may just be the start. Trump is warning he could cut far more personnel from the continent. We'll tell you what this means for NATO and America's allies bracing for even bigger changes. Remaining with world affairs, the Trump administration is pursuing two contradictory strategies in the Middle East simultaneously. Our Middle East correspondent Layla Nazari has more. Layla?
Thanks, Emma. So what we're seeing here is the U.S. fast-tracking an $8.6 billion arms package to Middle East allies without going through Congress, right? At the exact same time, Trump is dismissing Iran's new peace proposal. He said Iran hasn't paid a big enough price yet. It's a pretty mixed message. You're arming one side while supposedly staying open to talks with the other.
Does this suggest the administration doesn't actually believe negotiations are going anywhere?
Well, look, I think it's more complicated than that. The emergency approval allows the State Department to move fast, which they say is necessary given security threats. But here's the thing. If you're genuinely negotiating, flooding the region with weapons doesn't typically help your credibility. Iran's likely reading this as the U.S. preparing for conflict, not peace. That's not going to make them more flexible at the negotiating table.
Layla, appreciate it. Remaining with world affairs, the delicate diplomacy around Iran is showing deep cracks even as formal negotiations continue. And still with Layla, what's the latest from Tehran?
Well, Emma, so Iran submitted this 14-point plan Wednesday, which they're framing as a serious response to U.S. proposals. But here's the thing. On the exact same day, Iran's carrying out executions of people they say were spying for Israel. So you've got negotiations happening on one track, and the judiciary basically telling the world to back off on the other. It's a pretty stark mixed message.
Does Trump's skepticism about making a deal mean these negotiations are already dead?
Look, not necessarily dead, but Trump's being pretty clear he doesn't think Iran will meet U.S. demands. What's interesting is he's also claiming hostilities have already terminated under the ceasefire. So there's this tension between saying the war is over and also saying he can't cut a deal with Iran. The real risk here is if military operations pick up again in the region, particularly with Israel still pounding Lebanon, the whole diplomatic framework collapses pretty quickly.
Layla, appreciate the clarity on that. Continuing on world affairs, as Ukrainian President Zelensky seeks a potential ceasefire with Russia by strengthening ties in the Gulf region, President Trump is keeping military options on the table against Iran. Trump says the U.S. could launch additional strikes against Tehran, raising stakes in an already volatile Middle East. Expect further developments as these diplomatic and military pressures collide in coming weeks. Moving to us now, the Pentagon is planning to pull thousands of American troops out of Germany, and it's sparking serious concern among Republicans about America's commitment to NATO. Our Washington correspondent Marcus Webb has more. Marcus?
Well, Emma, that's right. The Pentagon is drawing down about 5,000 troops from Germany, and this is happening right in the middle of a feud between the White House and the German Chancellor. What's important here is that the U.S. has more military personnel in Germany than anywhere except Japan, so this is a pretty big deal for European security. NATO's already working to understand what exactly the plan entails.
What's got Republicans so worried about this?
Look, they're concerned this sends the wrong message about America's commitment to NATO and European security. I mean, Germany's been a critical hub for American military operations across Europe and the Middle East for decades. Senators like Jim Inhofe are saying this undermines the alliance right when tensions are high. The administration says there'll still be thousands of troops staying behind, but Republicans don't think that's enough.
Marcus, appreciate it? The conflict between the U.S. and Iran has now stretched into its 10th week, with energy prices climbing and no clear end in sight. President Trump says he's reviewing a new 14-point peace proposal from Iran, but he's signaling serious doubt the offer will work, warning that Iran hasn't paid enough of a price. Watch for whether Trump's review leads to actual negotiations or whether military action resumes within the coming weeks. Remaining with this developing story, the collapse of Spirit Airlines raises questions about how the Trump administration weighs corporate bailouts and what happens to millions of stranded passengers. Marcus, good to have you back.
Well, Emma, thanks. So Spirit announced the shutdown overnight after the Trump administration's $500 million bailout offer fell apart. The airline had been hemorrhaging money from fuel costs and debt, and they'd been hoping for a rescue all week. But when negotiations with bondholders failed and Congress allies opposed the deal, it all came crashing down. Now we're looking at an airline that just vanished. No more flights, no warning, just done after 34 years.
What does this mean for the thousands of people who had Spirit tickets booked?
Look, it's a mess. These passengers are basically stuck right now. They're being told not even to show up at the airport because there are no flights. They'll get refunds eventually, but there's going to be delays and frustration. What's interesting is this happened so fast. The administration was still negotiating Friday, and by Saturday, the airline was shuttered. That tells you how fragile these negotiations were and how quick things collapsed.
Marcus, appreciate the reporting. A secret network is smuggling Starlink internet terminals into Iran, providing citizens with uncensored access to information as the government tightens control over online communications. The operation, run by a man named Sahan, defies Iranian authorities who view satellite internet as a security threat. Watch how this underground effort could reshape information access in one of the world's most censored countries. The conflict in Ukraine is taking to the skies in unprecedented ways. Ukrainian drones have forced the closure of a major Moscow airport, marking another escalation in unmanned warfare that's redefining modern combat. Ukrainian forces are now striking deep into Russian territory, from military infrastructure to civilian areas, using increasingly sophisticated drone technology. As these operations intensify, watch for Russia's response and how this drone-centered warfare reshapes the broader conflict. Moving to the markets, a Middle East crisis is reshaping how billions flow through the global energy sector. Renewable energy funds are attracting their biggest inflows in 5 years as investors and governments shift focus from climate concerns to energy security. But that same energy crunch is hitting developing economies hard. Vietnam's April inflation jumped higher than expected as oil prices surge, raising costs for transport and production. Now, our in-depth analysis of the day. The story dominating the headlines, examined from every angle. We are watching what could be one of the most consequential shifts in Western security architecture since the end of the Cold War. President Trump has ordered the withdrawal of 5,000 U.S. troops from Germany, warned that cuts are going much further, and NATO allies are rattled, with Spain and Italy reportedly next in line. Germany's defense minister says it's foreseeable, which raises the question: foreseeable and yet still unprepared. Joining me now are Marcus Webb, our defense and security analyst, and Sophia Reeves, our economics and markets editor. Marcus, let me start with you. Is Trump blowing up the Western alliance, or is he finally doing what no one else had the guts to do?
Thanks, Emma. Let's be absolutely clear about what's happening here. This is not recklessness. This is 3 decades of deferred accountability arriving all at once. Germany, the 4th largest economy on the planet, spent the better part of 30 years treating the NATO 2% target like optional homework. Merkel smiled, collected the trade surpluses, kept the gas pipeline to Moscow running, and let American enlisted men and women subsidize German security, while Berlin lectured Washington about the importance of multilateralism. Douglas Murray has been making this argument for years. Europe developed a kind of strategic infantilism, a refusal to take its own defense seriously because the Americans would always be there. Well, now they might not be. And I would argue that this moment, as uncomfortable as it is potentially the most important catalyst for genuine European rearmament since the Soviet threat dissolved. The question isn't whether Trump is being diplomatic. He's not. The question is whether the shock therapy works.
But, Marcus, here's the counter-argument that a lot of serious defense analysts are making. You don't withdraw 5,000 troops while Russia is actively killing civilians in Ukraine, while there are drone strikes in Kherson happening this very weekend. Isn't the timing catastrophically dangerous regardless of the underlying principle? And Sophia, what's your take on this?
Well, look, Marcus isn't wrong about the burden-sharing problem, but I think he's letting the cart lead the horse here. Here's what I think Marcus is missing. The economic cost of strategic uncertainty is enormous, and it lands immediately. The moment you signal to markets and to adversaries that the American security guarantee is variable, contingent, and subject to Twitter announcements, you've changed the risk calculus for every investment, every defense contract, every alliance negotiation in Europe. Germany's defense ministry says it's foreseeable. Fine, but foreseeable doesn't mean manageable. The accumulated underspending across NATO's European members over 30 years has been estimated at over $1 trillion. You cannot close that gap in 12 months. So while the principle of burden sharing is entirely correct, the execution here, 5,000 troops, more threatened, no clear framework for what comes next. That's not leverage, that's instability. And markets hate instability more than they hate bad policy.
I hear what Sophia is saying, but with respect, that misses the point entirely. You know what else creates instability? Telling Vladimir Putin for 30 years that NATO will always be there, no matter what Europeans do or don't spend. That's the instability that produced the invasion of Ukraine. The uncomfortable truth is that soft guarantees invite hard aggression. And look, 2 people were killed in Kherson in a drone strike this weekend. Russia is making frontline progress right now. Does anyone seriously believe that a few thousand American troops in Germany are the thin line between European security and Russian expansion? The real deterrent is European militaries that can actually fight. Short sentences matter here. Build the armies, fund the equipment. Stop relying on American families to bear the burden. That's the only long-term answer.
Here's what I want to know, and this is the question that keeps me up at night. If Spain and Italy are next, if this is the beginning of a systematic American withdrawal from European defense, where does this end? Sophia, where do you see this going over the next 6 months?
The way I see this playing out, you get one of 2 outcomes. Either this functions as genuine leverage. MERDs and the European leaders feel enough pressure that you start to see binding, credible rearmament commitments with real timelines and real funding, which would actually be a net positive for Western security over a 5 to 10-year horizon. Or, and this is the risk, European political paralysis kicks in. Brussels retreats into its default mode of committees and strategic papers, and the trajectory continues toward a real security vacuum in Central Europe at the worst possible moment. Given the pace of Russian advances in Ukraine right now, that second scenario should terrify everyone in this conversation.
Here's what concerns me most, the third scenario that nobody is talking about. If American drawdown accelerates and European cohesion fractures, France will move to position itself as the dominant European defense power. Macron has been signaling this for years. That is not necessarily good news for Poland, the Baltic states, or anyone who has historically relied on the American security umbrella as a check on great power ambitions within Europe itself. The risk here isn't just Russia. It's a European security architecture that fragments along national interest lines, with smaller nations left exposed. History tells us that's exactly the kind of vacuum that creates the conditions for serious miscalculation. Trump may be right on the principle and dangerously wrong on the sequencing, and that combination is what keeps serious defense analysts awake at night.
Powerful analysis from both of you. One thing's certain, someone in the Bundestag is definitely not sleeping well tonight, and frankly, given 30 years of taking American security for granted, that might be exactly the point. It's being called one of the most dramatic Kentucky Derbies in years. A 23-1 long shot named Golden Tempo storms down the stretch at Churchill Downs. A horse named Great White throws its jockey at the starting gate in a terrifying scene before the race even begins. And a woman named Cherie DeVos becomes the first female trainer to win the most storied race in American horse racing. And somehow, the New York Times leads with the hats. Joining me now are Sophia Reeves, our economics and markets editor, and James Chen, our geopolitical analyst. Sophia, let me start with you. Is the media coverage of this derby actually doing justice to what happened, or are we watching a great American story get slowly strangled by the wrong narrative?
Thanks, Emma. Look, what happened at Churchill Downs on Saturday was genuinely extraordinary, and I mean that without any qualification. A 23-1 shot wins the Kentucky Derby. A woman trains the winner, the first woman to ever do it in 152 years of this race. And a man in the crowd has a seizure that leads to a diagnosis that might have saved his life. These are remarkable stories. But watch how the media handles them, Emma, because it tells you everything. The New York Times runs a fashion piece on the hats. The networks immediately reach for the DEI framing on DeVos, treating her achievement not as the product of a lifetime of expertise and competitive excellence, but as some kind of institutional progress report. It's insulting. It's reductive. Ben Shapiro has said it better than I can. Genuine competitive meritocracy produces the outcomes that identity politics claims to want, and then the left swoops in and colonizes the achievement. DeVos didn't win because of a quota or a diversity initiative. She won because she's brilliant at her job. And the second the media makes it about anything else, they actually diminish what she did.
But Sophia, isn't there an argument that simply acknowledging the first woman to do something in 152 years, is just recording history accurately? Is it really DEI framing to note that this is a barrier broken? And James, what's your take on this? Where does legitimate historical recognition end and political co-option begin?
Well, look, I think Sophia's raising a real tension, but I'd push back slightly on the framing. Here's the thing. The Kentucky Derby is fundamentally a free market story, and I think that's actually the more powerful lens here. Churchill Downs Incorporated generated over $1.9 billion in revenue in 2024. The Derby generates roughly $225 million in economic activity for Louisville every single year. This is a private sporting institution that has maintained its identity, its tradition, its genuine competitive integrity across 152 years, and it has done so precisely because it hasn't allowed institutional interference to dilute the product. Cherie DeVos winning is a free market outcome. The best trainer with the best horse on the day won the race. That's the story. And yes, recording that she's the first woman is historically accurate. But the moment institutions start trying to manufacture those outcomes rather than allowing the market to produce them, you corrupt everything. The Kentucky Derby's power comes from the fact that it is ruthlessly real.
I hear what James is saying, but and I mean this with respect. I think he's actually underselling the cultural dimension here. This isn't just an economic story. The Kentucky Derby is one of the last great American traditions that has not been hollowed out. It hasn't been kneecapped by the politics that have destroyed the NFL's reputation, or infected the Oscars, or turned the Super Bowl halftime show into a political lecture. And that's precisely why we should be vigilant about it. The moment the DEI machinery gets its bureaucratic hands on horse racing, you'll see the same thing that happened to every other American institution that let it in. You'll see racing directors appointed for reasons other than expertise. You'll see the word inclusion in every press release. And 10 years from now, people will wonder why the product feels hollow. Tradition isn't a dirty word. It's the infrastructure of excellence.
Here's what I want to know, and I'm going to push both of you on this. Given everything we saw at this Derby, from the dramatic scratch of Great White to the 23-1 upset to DeVos' historic win, where does the Kentucky Derby itself go from here? Is this a moment that strengthens the institution, or does the narrative around it actually create the very pressures that could change it? James, where do you see this playing out?
The way I see this playing out is actually quite optimistic in the near term, but with a real medium-term risk. In the next 6 months, DeVos' win generates enormous commercial interest. sponsorships, television deals, human interest coverage that actually grows the sport's audience. That's genuinely good. The risk, though, is that success attracts exactly the kind of corporate and activist attention that changes the incentive structure. If current trends in American institutional life continue, and I think they will, there will be pressure on Churchill Downs to formalize what happened organically. To create DEI structures, diversity hiring mandates, representation targets in training programs, and the moment you do that, you've replaced a free market of talent with a managed outcome. History tells us that never ends well for the sport.
Here's what concerns me most, and this is actually about the broader American cultural moment, not just horse racing. Mark Toothaker's story. A man goes to the Kentucky Derby in person, has a medical episode, gets a diagnosis that saves his life. That doesn't happen if he's watching on a screen. The real risk here is that America is losing its appetite for shared physical experience, for being actually present at great events, in a crowd, in a specific place, with all the unpredictability that entails. The trajectory suggests that the Kentucky Derby's greatest cultural contribution in 2026 might not even be the race itself. It might be the reminder that showing up in the real world still matters. And if we lose that instinct as a culture, we lose something that no algorithm can replace.
Sophia Reeves, James Chen, what a conversation. One thing's for certain, somewhere in a box stall in Louisville tonight, a 23-1 long shot named Golden Tempo is eating better than most of the journalists who failed to pick him.
That's all for this update. Stay informed and stay connected. I'm Emma. We'll be back shortly.